welcome to A Tippling Philosopher with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Today I'm going to do a reaction video, which is something I've never really done before, but this is a philosophical reaction video to two of my favourite people on earth. William Lane Craig, the Christian philosopher and theologian, and Ben Shapiro, So I'll be reacting to both these people talking about theology and supposedly debunking top atheist arguments. And I'll see whether any of these kind of claims hold any water. I haven't heard this before, so this will be a sort of live reaction. So let's get straight to it. This is, you can find this on YouTube. William Lane Craig debunks the top atheist arguments. Take it away, boys.
Let's talk about a couple of those philosophy arguments from 101 that are constantly trotted out. I've had similar experiences. The most common one that I've heard, of course, is the problem of evil, the suggestion that how can God be good if so much evil takes place in the world? The more sophisticated version of the argument to me is not the problem of human evil, which seems pretty easily disposable, but the problem of natural evil things happening to children.
Whoa, okay. First of all, human evil isn't easily disposable. I mean, wow, what a hand wave. Like, the problem of evil is one of the thorniest issues for theologians and apologists. And he is right in saying that natural evil is the stronger of the arguments. Yeah, natural evil is a big problem because you can't blame humanity so easily for all of the things that have gone wrong. So really, it's like resting on God. So the option is, well, either it's God's fault or it's not God's fault. And with earthquakes and plate tectonics, there aren't very many options other than saying, well, God couldn't have created life without plate tectonics, and therefore, earthquakes were necessary and tsunamis were necessary, in which case the death of 230,000 people in 2004 was necessary as part of the creation of life. Well, that limits A, God's ability to do perpetual miracles, and B, God's ability to actually create without using plate tectonics to formulate life in some way. So that's a real problem. So the other option is to say, well, there are two other options. One is to blame humans still. So it's humans' fault in the fall. Everything was idyllic paradise before Adam and Eve ate the fruit, even though they didn't have any knowledge of good and evil at the time because they hadn't eaten the fruit at that stage. So why could they be blamed for eating the fruit and in so doing disobeying God? Bit of a problem. Anyway, forget that. But Adam and Eve could be blamed, or humanity in general, if you see it as a symbolic story, could be blamed for natural evil. Really, really problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. So the other option, and Craig might go down this route, is to say, well, God is not obligated to be a moral agent. He's not a moral agent. So therefore, that there's all this suffering on earth. God just has the right to take life and do what he likes because he's not a moral agent. Like, oh, okay. So it'd be interesting to see where he goes. But Shapiro already has just waved away all of the problem of evil to do with why there's genocide when God could have stopped it. Why is there this when God constrained our free will in the Bible by interacting at all the points he did supposedly in the Bible. Each of those points are by definition constraining human freely willed actions because God is getting involved and saying, no, this isn't happening. And actually, say hardening Pharaoh's heart, completely taking away the Pharaoh's own free will and then punishing all of the Egyptian nation on behalf of that decision that God enforced. So, even that kind of human evil, that was directly done by God. But, I think just saying that, it's easily debunked. What are you talking about? Like, the free will theodicy doesn't make any sense. The soul building theodicy doesn't make any sense because there isn't free will and there aren't souls. And the original sin theodicy doesn't make sense because original sin is just a broken design feature. So what are you left with? Come on, present how you easily debunk, suffering as a result, human suffering, that isn't natural evil. Just, no, I'm not having that. I'm not having it.
Child with cancer. How does a good God rule over a world in which children die of natural causes, in which kids are born with Tay-Sachs, in which horrible things happen to good people?
Yes. In dealing with this problem, I think it's really important that we distinguish between what I call the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil.
Just a little point here. I've missed William Lane Craig's voice. I haven't heard it in so long.
There is no doubt that emotionally, the evil and suffering in the world make it very difficult to believe in God. It's a tremendous emotional obstacle. But intellectually, considered dispassionately as a philosophical problem, it's extraordinarily difficult to show that there's either any inconsistency or improbability between the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God and the evil and suffering in the world. The atheist would...
Okay, interesting. So he does differentiate between the emotive appeal of the argument and its intellectual credentials, which is a perfectly valid point. However, there's some really interesting arguments, and I deal with this in my book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan and Divine Design. I talk about in the natural evil, or near the natural evil section, actually, another little bit about whether the intellectual arguments do enough in terms of getting over the experiential issues of suffering. Like, it's just not good enough. In fact, I'll find a quote just to support that. So I'll pause this a second. Yeah, so Yugen Nagasawa talks about this in terms of divine hiddenness. So when you've got the suffering and God isn't there, and persecuted Christians being tortured and whatnot, and God doesn't come and give them any support or do anything about it, then there's a really distinct lack of God being there, the divine hiddenness. But the actual persecution, the experience of being persecuted, to then explain that away with some kind of intellectual argument, Nagasawa says it doesn't do justice to the experience of suffering. So he says from a book that he contributes to, his chapter Silence, Evil and Shusaku Endo in a book about divine hiddenness by Green and Stump. He says, page 254, I maintain, however, that theodicies do not eliminate the problem of divine absence altogether because they fail to answer the experiential problem. Remember, Craig is just about to give you some theodicies, and Nagasawa is saying they don't do the job because the experiential problem which concerns the pain and suffering of real people. We are mistaken if we think that theodicies can eliminate the experiential problem. That would perhaps be as absurd as thinking that we could eliminate a toothache with an intellectual argument. And so there's this disparity between the experience of pain and suffering, which we can talk about the emotiveness that entails, and the intellectual explanations thereof. So, again, Craig's possibly doing just another hand wave here, just like Shapiro did.
Would have to show that it is either impossible or improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the natural and moral evil in the world.
So this is precisely what atheists do. Now, the logical problem of evil is say that God's omni characteristics, all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, should mean that there should be no gratuitous evil. So the theist comes back and says, well, these aren't logically consistent. It could be that all the evil and suffering that we experience and see and acknowledge is somehow necessary. Therefore, there could be a reason. But then, of course, don't really present arguments of there being actual reasons, right? So as a result, you just go back to skeptical theism. Well, I don't know the mind of God. I can't know the mind of God, but there could be a reason. Therefore, there is a reason, and that's just not good enough. And if there's what you're basically saying, Craig will have to say that anything from stubbing your toe to 230,000 people dying in tsunami to cancer and Ebola. All of those things are absolutely necessary for a perfect God to achieve some end. There couldn't have been one fewer death, one less death, one less bit of pain, one fewer unit of pain amongst all the units of pain that have ever existed. There can be no less pain and suffering, and that's what Craig is forced to admit.
And how could he possibly show that? We're simply not in a position to make those kind of probability judgments with any confidence. And so I think that the problem of evil, as difficult as it may be emotionally, intellectually, it lays a burden of proof on the shoulders of the atheist, which is so heavy that it has proved to be unsustainable.
That's a massive assertion. Well, explain what you mean by the burden of proof there. Why is the burden of proof not on you in saying there could be a reason, it's not inconsistent, but not providing a reason? Whoa, you have just... Oh my goodness, the double standards is unbelievable here. That's outrageous. And actually, the evidential problem of evil massively supports naturalistic atheism over omnigod theism. So if you were to know nothing about the world, but only know that what created it was an all-loving creator, that God is love, God is infinite love, overflowing with love, and you think, right, what would the sort of world be, or the sort of universe be, that was created by an all-loving God? You wouldn't predict Ebola, cancer, tsunamis, black holes. You wouldn't predict a universe in which life is highly unlikely. It's really difficult to live, and there are more ways of dying than there are of living. So there are just the predictive value of omnigod theism is very low. It just doesn't predict this kind of universe, whereas naturalistic atheism could perfectly predict this universe. So theism loses on that. Now let's look at the universe from the other way, right? Say, okay, you've got two hypotheses. What better explains this data? And again, naturalistic atheism explains everything from evolution, pain, suffering. It not only predicts it, it also perfectly explains it. But to explain it by theism, you have to jump through hoops, you have to add things onto theism, and you have to present arguments that are appeals to an unknown, and that are just, conceptual possibilities. Well, there could be a reason why 230,000 people died. There could be a reason why you have to stub your toe in the morning, and that's necessary and is not gratuitous. Yeah, okay, there could be, but you're doing nothing to explain that, right? So the burden of proof should be on you there. And actually, in order to explain those things, if you try seriously to do that, you have to do all these add-ons that make God a very confusing and complex thing that you just don't have to have with naturalistic atheism. It just explains everything perfectly well. Thank you very much. I utterly just disagree with this. If this is debunking, well, I know we're not even 2 minutes in, but maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but this is not debunking.
These days, the other argument that is brought up in enormous amounts is the supposed backwardness of the Bible itself and biblical morality.
Oh, hang on. No, that was a debunking of the problem of evil. So William Lane Craig debunks top atheist arguments. That apparently debunked the problem of evil. Him just saying there's a difference between the emotive arguments and intellectual arguments, and the intellectual arguments do nothing to show that God is less probable than naturalistic atheism in terms of explaining the data. So therefore, God wins. I'm sorry, William Lane Craig knows better than that. That is terrible. Shapiro, if you suck that in, then whatever. Ugh.
This happens largely with regard to, for example, homosexual marriage. It's been brought up with regard to abortion, which I think is more, again, easily disposable, because I think there's a solid secular argument in favor of the protection of human life. But homosexual marriage is the one that most...
Is this another time when Ben Shapiro said, oh, that's easily debunked, and then does nothing to substantiate his claim? Okay.
Often comes up. You also hear arguments that the Bible permits slavery. So if the Bible is so wonderful, then why are there all these weird sections of the Bible where it talks about...
Only because I'm just going back to this. I can present a really convincing argument from a secular point of view that abortion is morally neutral. So, who wins the assertion Olympics here?
Wiping peoples from the earth, where it talks about enslaving other human beings. Some things that we would certainly consider moral evils today are contemplated by the Bible and not banned by the Bible. So why is that?
Well, let me address briefly first this question of slavery. When we hear the word slavery, Ben, we think of slavery as it existed in the American South.
Oh. I'm doing a video series on slavery, so you can check that out, based on Dr. Hector Avalos's book on biblical ethics and slavery. But he's doing the Paul Copan thing here, which is like, slavery is not slavery, it's servitude. It's not like you thought in the American South, except it's not. I mean, what Craig is doing here is it lying? He should know better. He does know better. This has to be lying or willful ignorance and really naive thinking. And I don't think Craig is naive. So you make up your own mind here. But when you're talking about, there's also a difference between Hebrew slaves and non-Hebrew slaves. Non-Hebrew slaves, like people you capture from in battle who are not Hebrews, you can rape their daughters, kill anyone that's not a virgin. You can do whatever you like. You own these slaves and yada yada yada, and treat them as badly as any other slave institution of slavery that we've seen around the world. So just this what he's just about to say is categorically not correct.
And as you know, that is nothing like the system that existed in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, there was no social safety net sponsored by the state. There was no poverty program. So if a man got himself into a situation where he couldn't pay his debts, he could keep his family together and retain his self-respect by selling himself as an indentured servant to his creditor until he could work off.
He is talking about one particular type of slavery here, as if this is representative. This is actually a form of apologetic called representativism. So he's cherry picking like the most benign form of slavery and saying this represents all slavery. But it doesn't. And there are far worse types of slavery within the Bible. And there are plenty of biblical quotes that you can just debunk Craig here with. It's just, this is child's play.
His debts, and then he would have to be set free. After 7 years, he had to be set free in any case. So this was really a form of indentured servanthood. It wasn't slavery as we think of that term. This was actually an anti-poverty program. And in some respects, I think it's better than what we have in modern Western culture, which destroys families, ruins people's self-respect because they're not working. Whereas in ancient Israel, a man retained his self-respect. He worked for an income. He paid his debts. He kept his family together. And that, to call that slavery, is just a gross misrepresentation. Now,
holy cow. Right, I'm going to have to just pause this to find some Bible quotes for you. So let's have a little look at how wonderful this was for poverty and welfare. I mean, this is a wonderful welfare state quote from the Bible. Let's look at Numbers 31. That said, then the Lord spoke to Moses saying, take vengeance on the Midianites for the sons of Israel. Afterward, you will be gathered to your people. So Moses spoke to the people saying, arm men from among you for the war, so they may go against Midian to execute the Lord's vengeance on Midian, so on and so forth. And then verse 7, so they made war against Midian just as the Lord had commanded Moses, and they killed every male. They were killed, the kings of Midian, along with the rest of those killed, so on and so forth, so on and so forth. Verse 9, and the sons of Israel took captive the women of Midian and their little ones, and they plundered all their cattle, all their flocks, and all their property. Then they burned all their cities where they lived, and all their encampments, and they took all the plunder and all the spoils, both the people and of livestock. They brought the captives and the spoils and the plunder to Moses, to Eleazar and the priest, and to the congregation of the sons of Israel, to the camp at the plains of Moab, which are by the Jordan, opposite Jericho. And verse 15 says, and Moses said to them, have you spared all the women? Behold, they caused the sons of Israel, through the counsel of Balaam, to be unfaithful to the Lord in the matter of Peor. So the plague took place among the congregation of the Lord. That's nice. Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man intimately. So in other words, keep the virgins. However, all the girls who have not known a man intimately, keep alive for yourselves, so sex slaves. And as for you, camp outside, blah, 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 so on and so forth. That's just one example of many that is simply, you've got sex slaves and the murder of everyone else, right? If he thinks that is some kind of welfare state that's so wonderful, so much better than these days, my mind is blown, and that's one of many. Like you just go and see my videos on slavery to show that that's absolutely not the case. He's taking the very best version of slavery, an indentured servitude of Hebrew people, like the in group, going through for 7 years, and then they get their jubilee, freedom in the jubilee year, in the 7th year, which is something that other cultures did as well, by the way. In ancient Near East, Mesopotamia. So it's nothing particularly wonderful about the Bible. But this is pure cherry picking and misrepresenting actually what is going on in the Bible. And in that sense, I think, as I said, arguably he's just outright lying. I mean, this is really bad apologetics. This is bad apologetics.
The first thing you mentioned, I forgot.
Homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage.
With respect to some of these other moral questions, I think we need to remember the first premise of the moral argument. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. Everything is socioculturally relative. So who's to say that the moral values of a society...
Okay, I don't want to open a whole can of worms about the moral argument. The moral argument is, if God exists, objective moral values exist. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists, or either way around, or whatever. Some kind of like version thereof, which is to say that the fact that objective moral values exist entails that God exists. But objective moral values don't exist because there is no abstract ideas or concepts exist outside of the human minds or like sentient beings' conceptual minds. So whether you believe in aliens or whatever, if all sentient creatures died, there would be no morality. That's just how conceptual nominalism works, and that's what I would argue for as an ontological foundation to reality. So objective moral values don't exist. They just don't exist. And that's not a problem. We construct morality ourselves conceptually, and when we agree on what we've set out, we write dictionaries, encyclopedias, and laws, and then we vote for people who enact the laws that we want enacted. But the fact of the matter is that even in the Bible you have intertestamental moral relativism. He's railing about moral relativism. So there are objective moral rules, and he's saying, yeah, but you can eat shellfish now. But even in the Bible, even in the Hebrew Bible, it says you couldn't. And there's 613 mitzvahs that say certain things that William Lane Craig won't adhere to anymore because they've been overwritten by the new covenant with Jesus. So all those old rules, they're just contextual, blah blah blah. It's like, yeah, so that's moral relativism, right? So they were morally correct for those people in that time, but not morally correct for anyone after the time of Jesus. Okay, you are admitting moral relativism. So his moral argument fails on that, as well as failing on philosophical grounds. I mean, heaps has been written on that. You can read my books, my last two books, Why I'm Atheist and Not Atheist, which sets out exactly how morality works and how ontology works, and the fact that for him to assert that there are objective moral facts is to assert that both facts and morality as abstract ideas exist in some kind of Platonic realm, so somewhere out there. Unless he's doing a circular argument for God, which is they exist out there only in God's mind. Well, then it's some kind of other conceptualism, but in God's mind. But then you're like, then that has its own problems, and it's really only objective in the sense that it's mind independent from our minds, but not that mind. So what do you mean by objective here? And then you get into the Euthyphro dilemma, which is, is God saying what is good because it's already good, or is he saying it's good because that's what he believes and he commands, which is to say that might makes right. One of them doesn't need God for morality because morality exists outside of him, and one of them just makes morality look arbitrary and might makes right. And so you have a further problem there, and which obviously Craig is not going to explain here. So all he's doing is yet another massive assertion without actually establishing any of what he says. And even if he did establish what he said, that would be met with derision from myself or a huge amount of criticism because, I don't think you can establish the moral argument as he sees it.
That discriminates against people and oppresses people is worse than one which is liberal and tolerant. We just sort of assume that the liberal values are the ones that would be objective, when in fact they're just as relativistic as any of the other ones on atheism. So,
on atheism and like the Hebrew Bible as well, right? I mean, you forgot to mention that all those 613 rules in the Old Testament that you no longer follow, I presume they're relative in some way, right? Have you got anything to say about that?
If we need God to be the anchor point for objective moral values,
we don't.
Values and duties, we cannot escape the question when thinking of moral right and wrong, well, what does God think of this? And if God proscribes something, it seems to me that's entirely within his right. If God were to say, thou shalt not eat beans, or thou shalt not eat pork, that would be our moral duty, and we should obey it. That is.
So this is divine command theory. So he's espousing divine command theory. In my book here, I've got 16 arguments against divine command theory. I've just done a video with critical faculty, completely taking apart those. Now's not the time to go through that, but wow, there are so many problems with divine command theory that he's just establishing this as it's just, well, yeah, this is obviously, whatever God says, whatever God commands is right, because he's the objective anchor point for morality. But whoa, there are huge problems with that. And unless you think I'm just, asserting, I mean, here's just a few of them. It makes morality arbitrary because there's no benchmark for morality. You can't use moral reasoning at all. So the direction of causality for morality is wrong. We're only good because we reflect God for no other reason. So it doesn't really work with ordinary morality and moral intuition and moral reasoning. Which God, which commands? How do you know you got the right God? How do you know you got the right commands and that you've interpreted them correctly? Because you can't use moral reasoning, remember, because if moral reasoning underwrites morality, then you don't need God. So therefore, it can only reflect God's moral behavior, can only reflect God's desires and actions himself, rather than being grounded in moral reasoning. So moral reasoning is completely redundant on Craig's theory. That's 5 of them. There's 16 of that. Basically, I'd have to do a whole video on that. But whoa, divine command theory is such a broken moral framework that if he thinks this debates the top atheistic argument, then there's no hope or help for him.
Is his prerogative as the moral lawgiver and the supreme good. And so if God says, my plan for human sexuality is heterosexual marriage, that's his prerogative. And there is no basis for calling that, I think, into question.
So let's talk about the...
Which is an admission of one of the problems of divine command theory, which is there's no basis to call anything. So God could command literally anything like murder and rape, which he does in the Old Testament. And you can't say that's wrong because you cannot question, you cannot give moral reasoning. You can't evaluate anything on moral reasoning, which is to say that any time, so say someone walks up and punches Craig in the face right now, God has allowed that. So you could go up and punch Craig in the face and say, well, God's allowed that. Look, he's literally allowed that. Who are you to question God's judgment? How do you know that's not God commanded me? How do you know that God hasn't commanded me? And because you can't use moral reasoning, you can't use moral reasoning to tell me why what I have done is bad. So if I'm saying that's a command from God, right, and I've fulfilled that command, you have no right to question that. The only thing you can question is my knowledge that came from God. But you wouldn't be able to say God wouldn't command that, because you're saying anything that God commands is by definition good. So you can say God wouldn't command that, punching me in the face, because that's bad, because the that's bad part of that statement is derived from moral reasoning. So Craig is just in a right bind here. Divine command theory is just fundamentally flawed. But Shapiro won't question that, of course.
Evolution of morality. And I want to go back to slavery for just a second. So it is true that Hebrew enslavement, that Jewish enslavement of others is really more indentured servitude. And there's a whole section in, I believe it's Numbers or Leviticus, I think it's Leviticus maybe, where it speaks to specifically about the slave who doesn't want to leave, and you're supposed to pierce his ear on the doorpost as a punishment for him not wanting to leave and all of this. But by the same token, enslavement of people who are not inside the.
Do you know what? Well done, Ben Shapiro. Fantastic. He's come back and actually challenged him on this. Nice one. Be interested to see where this goes. Maybe all of what I was saying was complete nonsense.
Yeah, Israelite inside the Jewish kind of tradition, that's not proscribed. So the idea of war captives is obviously taken into account and not banned. So certain things are banned in the Bible, certain things are not banned. Now, the way that biblical believers have practiced over time is that very early in the church's history, they're already starting to eliminate slavery, although not for people who are captured. And then over time, the West is the first place to eliminate slavery altogether, specifically citing the sections of the Bible that talk about human freedom and the innate value of every human being. So is that an evolution of morality, or is that a realization of a fundamental principle that was originally given to people who couldn't necessarily understand the full extent of the principle?
Oh, I think it's the latter, and I love the way you put it. I think that's nicely put. Jesus said something very much like this with respect.
I just want to stop there. So this is the idea that God couldn't outlaw slavery back then because it was too much for us to understand. So he had to do it bit by bit. As if Moses couldn't come down from Moab, from Mount Sinai, from Horeb with the tablets and say, rule number 1, slavery's bad. You don't need to understand why it's bad. Like, as if humanity couldn't understand why it was bad to enforce slavery of other humans. Like, as if that was too much to understand for human cognition then. But even if it was too much, like, if Moses said don't do it on pain of death from God, and God enforced that rule, like that anyone did commit slavery, God just killed them, then slavery would be known to be bad and would be ruled out from there. But God doesn't do that. So that whole argument that there's a progressive revelation that's necessitated here. I mean, this is called trajectorialism. It's on a trajectory. You go and see my slavery videos on this. It doesn't float. I disagree with it. Both that the Bible was itself like the foundation of the trajectory, because stuff like that was going on, and there were rules that were even better than the Bible in the ancient Near East already. So the fact that you say, the Bible is a better step up from everyone else and a necessary step towards the progress that we have now is a problem on that front. But it's also a problem because actually God could easily have just got to where we are now, like 2,000 years ago, and human cognition could have understood that. So I don't buy what Shapiro said as an excuse, an apology, and what Craig is agreeing with him about.
Back to Old Testament regulations on divorce. They asked him whether or not it was lawful to divorce a woman for any reason, and Jesus said, Moses allowed you to write a certificate of divorce.
Just a point here. Have they just got... Ben Shapiro came in with a really good point about non-Hebrew slaves here and non-Hebrew people being oppressed by the Hebrews. And has Craig just forgotten that and gone on to talk about Jesus talking about divorce? Is that too uncomfortable for him to answer? We'll see.
But it was not so from the beginning. And he cites then the creation story of Genesis of Adam and Eve and said, what God has put together, and let not man put asunder. So what Jesus was saying there was that the law of Moses was a temporary prescription accommodating the hardness of heart of the people at the time, but it didn't represent the perfect will of God for human marriage, which was grounded in the creation story.
So how exactly do we determine when we have moved beyond the biblical text in terms of the evolution of that morality? When are we fulfilling a broader goal that was...
This is actually a really good question from Shapiro, because in order to know the answer to that, you either need to know exactly what God has commanded if you're listening to Craig's position, which is you only get your morality from God's commands, or you do it through moral reasoning, which means you don't need God for morality, which means the objective moral argument falls apart. So it's going to be interesting to see what Craig says here. Like, how do we know we've reached the moral pinnacle? We've got to this goal. Well, if we're not going to have a direct revelation from God, we are going to have to evaluate that with our moral reasoning. But, you know, that can't do for morality, because divine command theory, as according to William Lane Craig,
that, you know, was kind of held back by temporary constraints. And when are we moving utterly beyond it? And again, here I'm thinking of same-sex marriage. So when it comes to same-sex marriage,
it's like Ben Shapiro's got an issue. He wants to really, like, he's got an issue with same-sex marriage, I'm thinking.
The argument is now being made by people in liberal churches, including Pete Buttigieg, who's running for president, that basically...
So now Shapiro couldn't get away from a bit of politics here. So yeah, Pete Buttigieg, who's gay and has a partner and a child, and is an awesome politician, in my opinion. But of course, Ben Shapiro, sitting firmly on the right against Democrats and against homosexuals, he's going to see if he can get some theological defense for his position.
Jesus was seeking equal respect for everyone. He cared about the least of these, and the prescriptions on homosexuality were really more, and homosexual activity were not eternal precepts, but were really attempting to crack down on the promiscuity of the time, or they were temporary expedients.
Yeah, I think that's clearly false. When you look at these regulations, both in the Old Testament and then they're repeated in the New Testament in the strongest terms in Romans chapter 1, there's no doubt that Paul is thinking of this as a moral law that has abiding significance. And it's grounded again, I think, in the creation story.
It's grounded again, I think, in the creation story. The title of this is William Lane Craig Debunks the Top Atheist Arguments. I think this is grounded in the creation story, and this really isn't an atheist argument. This is Shapiro trying to get defense for homosexuality is bad.
That God has created human sexuality, He's created man and woman in such a way that the fulfillment of that relationship will take place within the safety and security of a heterosexual marriage. And that outside of that, sexual activity is not to be indulged in. And this is a law that God has given us for our good. So I do not think that this is capable of simply being relativized to time and culture.
I hope you enjoyed that.
So basically, his argument against homosexuality is Romans, letter to the Romans in the New Testament, which is drawing on the story of Adam and Eve, the creation story. Well, I feel pretty debunked now. I'm going to just go out and tell gays are all wrong. This is morally wrong. Goodness, I feel I've been really debunked.
A clip from the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special. If you did, go ahead and hit the subscribe button.
Don't hit the subscribe button to his. Hit the subscribe button to mine, because if you do that, you would just get sucked into a vortex of hate and nonsense in equal measure.
So you stay up to date on all of our future content.
Don't do it. Don't do it. Bye, Ben. So there you go. Goodness me. I thought that would be have a lot more substance than it did. There were no, I couldn't even really see what the problem of evil is. An atheist argument. And then the morality of the Bible's bad is an atheist argument. So broadly, two arguments that were completely unsatisfactorily dealt with. And then there was a bunch of wishy-washy assertions and stuff. And ending up with a whole bunch of homosexuality is bad because of Romans and Adam and Eve. Just, I mean, goodness. Oh, well. I don't know what more to say other than that's pretty rubbish. There is a lot more to say on divine command theory, and I'll probably do a separate video on that entirely. But if not, you can check out my talks with Derek Lambert at Mythvision, where I've talked about that, and Neil Sendlak at Gnostic Informant, where I've talked about divine command theory, and critical faculty as well, where I've just talked about that this weekend. So I've talked about that a lot. There are places where you can find it. But yeah, tell me what you think. Did you enjoy this kind of reaction video? I think I quite like doing this. Let me know what you think. Please subscribe to my channel. You won't get nonsense and hate. At least I hope not. Please like the video. If you enjoy my content, please think about becoming a member, so you can join, or you can give thanks below if you are able to do so. So that would be hugely appreciated because it allows me to keep doing this. Anyway, as ever, question everything, particularly yourselves, and be good and nice.